The courtroom was nearly empty now, just a janitor sweeping beneath the pews, a clerk clicking her keyboard softly in the distance, and one man sitting still, hands folded over a printed document. He didn't move, didn't look up. The lighting overhead flickered once, briefly catching the side of his face, the kind of quiet weariness that comes only after a long goodbye. He hadn't expected to be here. Not like this. Not after everything he'd given, everything he'd surrendered. What weighed heavier than the lawsuit was the memory of her eyes the day she asked him. Not with force, not even manipulation, just trust. Or what he thought was trust. He'd said yes. And now, years ahead of him still, he sat in a suit that didn't quite fit, wondering if it was possible to reverse more than just a procedure. Wondering if dignity ever grows back the same way. This is a story about love, not the whirlwind kind, but the kind that makes you believe in permanence. About a choice that couldn't be undone, and the quiet reckoning that followed. If you've ever believed in dignity, loyalty, or love that stands the test of time, this story is for you. And as you listen, pay close attention. There's a small moment near the end that might surprise you. Just for fun, we'll ask, how many times did you hear the name Caleb Rivers? Get it right within 7 days. And we may feature your name in a shout-out as a thank you for being part of our Fiction Echoes family. Watching this later? Comment anyway. We read every word. If stories like this speak to your heart, we'd be honored to have you with us. Drop a comment. Tell us what touched you most. And if you haven't yet, feel free to like, subscribe, and tap the bell, so you'll never miss a story that reminds us what really matters. There was something about the way she sat. One leg folded beneath her, coffee cooling beside her on the railing, a scarf twisted just so in her hair. The neighborhood was quiet that morning, as it usually was in late spring, when the dogwoods began to bloom and the air smelled faintly of fresh paint and pollen. That's when he first saw her. Not at a party, not through friends, just on her porch. She was reading Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. He knew because he recognized the cover from his mother's bookshelf growing up. And even from across the street, there was a stillness about her. The kind of woman who didn't need anyone to look at her to know her worth. He didn't speak to her that day. Not the next either. But eventually, time, coffee, and neighborhood routines worked their quiet magic. She was 40, and she said it plainly, without hesitation, without shame. She had been married once, briefly. No children, no regrets. He was 25, new to the town, just starting his career in city planning. Still uncertain about whether he wanted roots or flight, but something about her steadiness drew him in. She didn't chase excitement, she embodied calm. And when she asked questions, she actually waited for the answers. They grew into each other slowly. Dinners that turned into Sunday mornings, drives with no destination, quiet laughter over pie at a 24-hour diner. Their rhythm didn't match the world's, but it suited them fine. She told him early on that her family had a history of cancer, ovarian, specifically. It had haunted her since her teens. Her mother passed at 47, her older sister at 39. She said it gently, "I don't want to pass that on." He didn't flinch. Not then. He'd always pictured kids, some vague future, tossing baseballs or clumsy Halloween costumes. But love, real love, he thought, it's about meeting someone where they are. And she was clear about where she stood. She never pushed, never pleaded. But over time, in a tone that felt more like confession than suggestion, she told him what scared her most. Not being unable to have children, but bringing someone into the world who might suffer like her mother did, who might watch their life count down too early. Eventually, she mentioned the vasectomy. Just once. He didn't say yes right away, but he thought about it for weeks. He pictured her reading on that porch, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the way she rested her head on his chest without saying a word. And then one day, without fanfare, he made the appointment. It was a small clinic on the edge of town, tucked between a dentist's office and an old record store. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic, just beige walls, polite forms, and the low hum of fluorescent lighting. The nurse called his name softly. He stood, heart steady, but mind full of imagined futures, the ones he was walking away from, and the one he thought he was walking toward. The procedure wasn't long. A few questions, a signature, a moment of silence in a sterile room. And then, after it was over, a simple instruction. Take it easy for a few days. Ice packs, rest. You'll be just fine. She picked him up afterward. Her eyes were soft when she saw him. She reached out and touched his shoulder, not as a reward, not as gratitude, but as something deeper. Something that said, "I see what this cost you." They drove home, mostly in silence, her hand resting gently over his on the console. That night, she made soup, the kind his mother used to make in winter. The TV flickered in the background, but neither of them watched. He dozed off early, her head resting lightly against his arm. For a while, everything felt closer, as if the sacrifice had sealed something. They weren't just in love, they were committed. Or so he thought. It started changing subtly. Not overnight, just enough to notice but name. She began spending more evenings alone, reading, walking, visiting a friend upstate more often. When he asked, she smiled and brushed it off. "Just need a little time to think, sweetheart. You know how I get in the spring." He did. She was always a little restless when the seasons changed. Always had one suitcase half packed, even when she said she wasn't going anywhere. Still, the quiet deepened. One morning, he came home from the store with her favorite lemon scones. She was sitting at the kitchen table, still in her robe, hands clasped around her coffee cup. She didn't look up when he walked in, just stared at the steam. And then, gently, like someone folding a letter they never wanted to write, she said the words, "I think I need some space." He paused. The bag crinkled in his hand. The clock ticked once behind them. Space. He tried to understand, asked if he'd done something wrong, if she was okay, if her fears had come back, about her health, about their future. But she didn't give reasons. She only gave distance. 3 weeks later, she moved out. No drama, no yelling, just a neat departure and a note left on the counter. It wasn't long after that he saw a photo, online, casually posted by a mutual friend. She was with someone else, older, confident, holding hands in front of an art gallery downtown. That night, he sat in his car outside the clinic where he'd made his irreversible choice. The sign still buzzed softly in the window. He didn't go in. He just sat. And finally, for the first time since the procedure, he let himself cry. It wasn't about the breakup. Not entirely. It was about something deeper. The feeling that his future had been traded in, and no one had asked if he wanted it back. Months passed. The seasons shifted. Spring into summer, then autumn, rustling its way into the trees. The world moved on. But inside him, something stayed stuck. He returned to work, answered emails, mowed the lawn. But his smile no longer reached his eyes, and the warmth that once lit his voice had gone quiet. People noticed, but they didn't ask. Not directly. A few friends tried. A shoulder squeeze here, a quiet, "You okay?" over lunch, but he never said much. What could he say? That he had made a permanent decision for someone who didn't stay. That he gave something sacred, not just trust, but the hope of future fatherhood. And now he sat with a silence where dreams used to be. One night he found himself back on her old street. The porch was empty now. No scarf in her hair, no coffee cup on the railing, just wind brushing the leaves and a dim porch light that no longer seemed to mean welcome. He didn't get out of the car. Instead, he stared at the house as if it might still hold an answer. Something small, something he missed. And it was then, not in anger, but in quiet clarity, that he began to wonder, was this fair? She hadn't forced him, she hadn't lied, but there had been an unspoken promise that they were building something together, that the sacrifice would be held with reverence, not abandoned like a jacket left on a park bench when the weather changes. That week, he spoke with a lawyer, not out of spite, not even revenge, but to ask the question plainly, is there anything I can do? He learned about reversals, that they were possible, that they cost money, that even then, there were no guarantees. The figure stunned him. Over $3,000. For a chance. Not even certainty. He sat in the lawyer's office, fingers tracing the wood grain on the desk, as if hoping it would steady his thoughts. She hadn't offered to pay for it. She hadn't even reached out. But she had been the reason. Her fear, her conviction, her insistence that love meant protecting future lives from pain, even if it meant ending the possibility of life at all. The lawyer asked if he wanted to sue. He didn't answer right away, not because he wasn't sure, but because part of him still didn't believe it had come to this. But yes, he would. Not to make a spectacle, not to hurt her, but to say, gently, firmly, that his future mattered too. The courtroom wasn't grand. No towering ceilings or polished marble floors, just faded carpet, wooden benches, and the slow creak of doors opening and closing as people came and went. He arrived early, a beige folder in one hand, a plain navy tie knotted at his collar. He hadn't worn it since a cousin's wedding the year before. He adjusted it once, then again, more out of nerves than need. Across the aisle sat the woman who, not long ago, had curled against him on rainy mornings and whispered dreams into his chest. She didn't look angry or afraid. She looked composed, as if none of this surprised her. She wore gray, the kind of gray that looked expensive, but modest. Her hair, once always pulled back in a soft twist, now hung loose around her shoulders. They didn't speak. The judge, a soft-voiced man in his 60s, called the room to order. Papers shuffled, chairs scraped. The world moved on. The lawyer explained the claim, the cost of a vasectomy reversal, $3,000, and the emotional breach of an agreement that wasn't written, but deeply felt. There was no shouting, no finger-pointing, just questions, quiet ones. Had she asked him to undergo the procedure? Had she led him to believe they had a shared future? Had she changed her mind about him, before or after he went through with it? Her voice, when she answered, was steady. I told him I couldn't have children, for medical and emotional reasons. I didn't force anything. I was honest. She paused, then looked briefly in his direction. But I didn't expect him to go through with it so quickly. I didn't know how to handle what came next. There it was. Not malice, not manipulation, just human uncertainty and the damage it leaves behind when love and fear are left to make decisions too heavy for either to carry alone. He listened. No anger in his eyes, only something quieter. A grief that had finally found a room big enough to breathe in. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't rehearse, didn't argue. He just said, I did what I did because I believed in us. I believed in her. And now, I have to live with that choice, unless I try to reverse it. This isn't revenge. It's just me trying to put the pieces of my life back where they were, if that's even possible. Silence settled in the room after that. Not uncomfortable, just still. The kind of stillness that comes when both truth and pain have been laid bare, and nothing more needs to be added. The judge said he'd take the matter under advisement. No decision that day. As the clerk called the next case, they both stood, not as lovers, not as enemies, but as two people who once shared something deep, and now stood in the quiet ache of what was left behind. The letter came 2 weeks later. A plain, white envelope, no seal, no drama, just a folded sheet of paper inside, typed in careful legal language. The court had ruled in his favor. Partial compensation. Not the full amount, but enough to cover the surgeon's consult and a portion of the procedure. The rest, the judge noted, was an emotional cost the law could not fairly calculate. He held the letter for a long time, not in triumph, not in relief, just stillness. It wasn't about the money. Not really. He'd known that from the beginning. It was about being seen, not as someone foolish for loving, but someone who had given deeply and needed space to heal. The reversal was scheduled a month later. The surgeon explained the odds, carefully, kindly. There were no guarantees. Time mattered. Scar tissue mattered. But there was a chance. A small, shining chance. He nodded. That was all he needed. The morning of the procedure, it rained. A soft, steady drizzle that tapped against the window of the surgical center and turned the sidewalks into mirrors. He didn't expect anyone to come. But as he sat alone in the waiting room, filling out the final form, he noticed a familiar scent. Rosemary and warm cotton. The same combination he once associated with Sunday mornings and quiet hugs in the kitchen. He turned. She stood there, no umbrella, hair slightly damp, hands empty, no apology on her face, but something else, a quiet, unspoken sorrow. She stepped forward, not close, just enough, and said softly, I thought I was doing the right thing. I really believed that. He didn't answer. Not right away. He just looked at her, really looked, and realized something. This wasn't someone evil. This wasn't a villain, just a person with wounds of her own. A person who'd been trying to protect the future, and in doing so had broken something in the present. He nodded once. So did I, he said. That was all. The nurse called his name. He stood, folded the letter into his coat pocket, and walked toward the hallway. Not to undo the past, but to reclaim whatever future was still waiting, whatever version of hope still lived in him, undimmed. Outside, the rain continued to fall. But this time it didn't feel cold. It felt like a beginning. Recovery was slower the second time. Not because of the physical pain, though that lingered, but because healing meant more than stitches and rest. It meant allowing himself to believe that some doors, once shut, might still open. That even after deep hurt, something good could still grow. He spent the first few days in solitude, a pile of books on the nightstand, old jazz records humming softly through the afternoons. Meals were simple, sleep was light, but there was peace in the routine, the kind that had felt impossible just months before. He didn't think about her much, not in the way he used to. She came to mind sometimes, yes, in the smell of coffee at dawn, or when he passed the bookstore they used to visit on weekends. But now, the memory carried no bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had been and what no longer was. One morning, about 3 weeks after the reversal, he sat on the park bench near the old bandstand. The sun filtered gently through the trees, casting speckled shadows across the path. Children ran by, laughing, kites flying behind them like colored wings. He watched, not with longing or regret, but with something simpler, stillness. And then, without meaning to, he smiled. Not a broad smile, not forced, just a soft, almost forgotten lifting of the corners of his mouth. He didn't know yet if the surgery had worked, wouldn't know for months, maybe not ever with certainty. But that day, in that moment, he realized he was no longer mourning what had been taken. He was beginning to make room for what could still be given. Later that week, he received a message. An old friend from college. Married now, with a toddler and another on the way. They were hosting a small gathering. Nothing big, just a backyard barbecue, some friends from the past, some from the present. Would he come? For a long time, gatherings like that had felt too heavy, too full of comparisons, of reminders. But this time, something nudged him forward. He said yes. When he arrived, the laughter hit him first. Then the smell of grilled corn and smoked brisket, the sound of screen doors creaking and folding chairs being unfolded. There were new faces, warm ones, curious ones, and among them, a woman named Laura. She wasn't flashy, she didn't ask too many questions, but when she spoke, she listened fully. And when she laughed, it came from the chest, easy, unself-conscious. They didn't exchange numbers that day. They didn't talk about past wounds or future plans. But when she passed him a glass of lemonade and said, "You look like someone who knows how to enjoy the shade," he chuckled and replied, "I'm learning." And he meant it. Autumn arrived again, as it always does, unhurried, patient. The leaves on his street turned amber and rust, the air cooler, gentler. Porch lights came on earlier. The world exhaled. It had been nearly a year since the courtroom, since the folded letter in the envelope, since the hallway of that clinic and the woman who once held his heart in quiet, trembling hands. He hadn't seen her again, not because of anger, not even avoidance, but because some chapters don't end with doors slamming or voices raised. They end with silence, respectful, wistful, and whole in their own way. He never told anyone what she said to him in that waiting room. He kept that moment folded like a private letter, worn at the edges but never torn. The reversal? It worked. At least that's what the doctors believed. His health was good, his odds better than before. But he wasn't rushing into anything. He'd learned, painfully and beautifully, that time is not the enemy. Time is a teacher. Laura, the woman from the backyard, became a quiet presence in his life. Coffee once a week turned into dinner once a month, sometimes with friends, sometimes just the two of them, sitting by the lake with a thermos and a blanket, not needing to fill the silence. She never asked what had happened before. She didn't need to. She met him where he was, not in the middle of a race to the future, but on the gentle path of learning how to trust again, how to believe that some things once broken don't stay broken. They weren't in love, not yet, but there was space for something like it. And this time he wasn't giving anything up to prove he was worthy. This time he was just showing up, fully, honestly. And somehow that felt like the most sacred act of all. One evening, as the sky turned that soft pink it only shows in October, he sat on the back steps of his house, a sweater pulled over his knees and a cup of tea in his hands. He thought about how close he'd come to believing his life had ended with that one decision. But here he was, whole, maybe even more so than before. And as the breeze rustled through the tall grass and the last bit of sunlight kissed the side of his face, he whispered, not to anyone, not for anyone, but just because it needed to be said, "I didn't lose everything. I found something else." Then he closed his eyes and let the wind carry it. Some choices echo louder than others, not because of the moment they were made, but because of the quiet after. He said yes out of love. She let go out of fear. And somewhere between those two truths, a life was altered. Not ruined, not wasted, but reshaped. There was no villain here, no perfect ending either. Just a man who walked through loss with dignity and learned that even irreversible things can open new doors, if met with grace. And now, a question for you. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments, what moment in Caleb Rivers' journey moved you the most? And if you were listening closely, you might have noticed how often his name came up. Just for fun, How many times did you hear Caleb Rivers in the story? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you're right within 7 days, we may feature your name in a shout-out as a thank you for being part of our Fiction Echoes family. Watching this later? Don't worry, we still read every comment, and surprises may still come your way. And if you enjoy meaningful stories like this one, the next chapter is already waiting. Just click the video that's softly glowing on your screen now, and let the echoes continue.